Lawson Deming does the visual effects for the new Apple series Ted Lasso. And I'm Matt Noble of Gold Derby here to ask you, Lawson, what is the trickiest thing with the visual effects for a show like Ted Lasso?
Oh man, the trickiest part of visual effects for Ted Lasso, specifically, I think, has been the pandemic. Pandemic has put everybody indoors, and the show depicts an outdoor sport
Yeah.
with thousands of fans in attendance. The pandemic really hit while they were in production, and it changed a lot of plans in terms of how they were going to do a lot of the stadium work. Now, granted, whenever you're doing large stadiums, you always expect some level of visual effects. But the number of visual effects shots increased pretty significantly once we realized that we were rarely going to even be able to get 10 people next to one another for a sideline. And then we weren't even going to be able to shoot plates of people in some cases. So we transitioned to almost, I say almost because there's a few shots that includes practical people, but an almost fully digital double solution for the show. And that's something that normally you don't want to do when you see people in focus too close to the camera. And that made it really challenging because we were doing it even in situations that we traditionally would not have wanted to do that technique in.
Well, what when people are going over and watching season one of the show, was there a particular scene or visual effects that you worked on there that was that you're particularly proud of?
I wouldn't point to a particular scene that I think stands out to me as like the most proud of the effects. But I think in general, the way that they managed to shoot a lot of the gameplay scenes with, there was rain that happened sort of incidentally during some moments. There were some very complex handheld shots. There were some very low, steady cam moves. What I was really proud of is that we didn't really make any sort of gameplay or camera motion off limits. We just let them shoot as if they were in a real space. And for those who don't know, they were just playing on a practice field. So they weren't even playing to an empty stadium. They were playing to no stadium. So we built not only the crowd, but the stadium around them. And they had production lights in the shot, especially when it was raining. Those lights were flaring into the lens. And so we would actually do things like we would move the lights around in the stadium. The stadium has stationary lights in it. But if we said, oh, there's this really weird lens flare coming from this part of the shot, let's just move the stadium lights over just a little bit so it looks like the real lens reflection and flare and burnout in the rain is coming from the stadium. I'm really proud of how we were able to do things like that to just make these very extemporaneous shots feel more real.
Yeah, and I think like a show, like there are some shows that have monsters and explosions and all that, but a show like Ted Lasso, I would imagine as a visual effects artist, the sort of role that you see yourself having is one where people don't even notice the visual effects that are in
Right.
the thing. What's it like, sort of like having to make your work so that it's almost not seen?
I actually enjoy invisible visual effects a lot. And, we've always said, sometimes the biggest compliment you can get is people not reacting at all because they don't realize that anything was done in visual effects. I mean, certainly in the business, we know sort of instinctively, like, oh, well, you're never going to shoot at a full stadium. It's just not how it's done. So to me, whenever I see in a commercial or a TV show a stadium full of fans, I always think, well, that's interesting. There's the visual effects for this. But I think part of what made Ted Lasso particularly effective in not feeling like visual effects is just sort of, again, the matter of factness of how it was presented, the qualities of the show. It wasn't out there trying to impress people, because there is a version, I'm sure, of a sports show that is more like a big, King Kong feeling action where they're doing crazy shots and stuff like that, and really, pushing the action of it. But we wanted it to just feel, I'm ecstatic when people don't think there were any visual effects or just don't even think about them, because that's really what you want in a show like that. You want the visual. If a show is about the visual effects, then yeah, you want the visual effects to be front and center. But if a show's not about the visual effects, you've done something wrong if people are noticing it, right?
Yeah. Do you think was there a particular thing you had to add or do in one of the episodes which like just took a really, really long time? Like, I'm sure everything takes a long time, but sort of like relatively a long time.
I would have to probably talk to my comp supervisor about that. Some of the things that we did that became very complex visually was and this is so funny because it sounds so completely mundane when I talk about it, but the hoarding around the outside of the field. So basically those LED screens that, form the barrier around the field, and they tend to have advertisements and things like that on them that are just, it's the same thing. They change colors and stuff like that. So that was also part of the visual effects. And we had to not only create these LED screens around, fake CG LED screens around the side of the field and make them look like they were flickering a little bit or like there were some bulbs that were burned out, but then we also needed to come up with advertisements to go on those. And again, like the advertisements had to be for, an airline or this or that, like these things that if you're watching the show, I worked on them and I don't even remember what they are. Like we had to make them like completely forgettable, but also significant. And then if two shots came back to back, we had to say, okay, well, the camera's facing this way. Oh, we're seeing the same part of it. So we need the same ad to be playing on the next shot because it was playing on the previous shot, and so on and so forth. So we were doing things like that. We were the field itself. Again, I said the actual gameplay for the most part was done on a practice field. That's not the size of a real regulation field. So all the props and everything were shrunk slightly to be the right size relative to that. There were things like the goal nets. Sometimes they were not shot against a green screen all the time. So you have this thin, white netting, and all that had to be rotoscoped out with balls going into it and then it bouncing around in shots. So there was there's no like, oh, here was this huge shot that we did that was really crazy. It was more like, oh, here's these things that you wouldn't think would be a problem, but that were very finicky to deal with.
Oh boy, like you're probably one of the first people who's like had like intentionally tried to make unmemorable ads.
Yeah. Essentially, yeah.
What is your favorite thing about the series?
My favorite thing is that everyone seems to like it so much. To be honest, I think, a lot of people react to it at first. They're like, I don't know if I can get on board with this concept. It seems like it's not going to go anywhere. Like it's, especially because the original iteration of the character was just for, a series of like bumpers for League, that people are very suspicious of it going in, and they're, immediately won over by Jason Sudeikis's character and just by the whole sort of feel of the show. And to have that sort of reaction always, because there's so many shows on TV, and there's big shows, small shows, and sometimes we've worked on very, big shows with a lot of visual effects, and people are like, I've never heard of that show. And it's totally fine if people haven't heard of a show, because again, there's shows I've never heard of, right? And I'm in the business. But to have a show that like everyone seems to be able to relate to and everyone likes, and that just, it made people feel so good to watch it, is like, it makes it feel even better, even if we're doing the same work on that as we might be doing on something else. I really enjoy that.
Mm. Is there like was there something like growing up or like sort of early on in your career that sort of inspired you to go into visual effects, or a particular film's visual effects or TV series visual effects that you were like, whoa, I want to do that?
I found growing up that like many kids, I did make believe stuff growing up. And I remember receiving a book for, I don't know if it was a birthday present or what. It was a book that was like a kid's version of a behind the scenes of Star Wars. And it was like, this is how movies work. This is how frames in a camera work. And then it got to the point where they were talking about, the spaceships, how they bought a bunch of model kits and they built all the ships in Star Wars from scratch, from models. And like, I was building stuff out of models and Lego and at the time, and I was like, wow, you can have a job doing this. And it's way better than the make-believe I'm doing, because the make-believe I'm doing is just sort of in my head. But like, these are people who get paid to make the most realistic make-believe possible without actually getting in a spaceship and flying in space. And so that's what I wanted to do essentially. And my parents supported it because I took it so seriously, essentially. It was like, I'm building every Lego thing I built, every weird drawing I did was a stepping stone towards a career. It wasn't just me goofing around. And so that's how I got into visual effects.
Yeah. What's the best thing you ever made out of Lego?
Inspired by the Star Wars Lego thing, or inspired by the Star Wars models, and seeing like, oh, they built a bunch of models and then they put some explosives in them and they blew them up. I built Lego Star Wars ships, TIE fighters and X-Wings, and then I took them down to the basement and I hung them up with like fishing wire, and then I just smashed them. Basically, I would find a baseball or something like that, or a tennis ball, and I didn't have a camera, so I wasn't filming it, but I was like, okay, just do it like what they did. So they got it up here against a black background, and then I'm going to wing something at it and then watch it break apart into pieces, and that'll be like it just blew up.
Oh, that's so cool. What's something you learnt through your work on Ted Lasso?
I think a big thing that I learned on Ted Lasso, and that we all learned, because I will say that, I have the privilege of taking credit for it in a big way, because I am the owner of Barnstorm Visual Effects that did a lot of the work on the show. But like, there's many people who worked on it, so I'm not the only one. But what I learned personally is that there's always, you're never finished growing in a particular area of your work and your knowledge. We've done crowd stuff in the past on shows, and set extensions and CG builds and stuff like that. And I mean, it's a lesson that I'm constantly learning. I don't ever think I've learned everything, but I think every project you do experience the same kinds of things, but in a different way. So for example, like the lighting, this thing with the lighting and moving the lights around, like we'd never thought about doing that before. And it was a lesson that we had to learn while working on the show in order to make everything come together. The stadium, we built large structures before, but the stadium in some ways was completely different in terms of some of the materials involved and understanding like, okay, well, after the game, how do people get up from their seats? How does the stadium start to clear out? You know, like, even though we'd worked with moving crowds before, it was just, you're just thinking about a slightly different thing. And so to me, it's like, no matter what you're doing, no matter how many times you've done something or think you've done something, there is always room to learn how to get better at it and to do it a little differently the next time. And we're even doing that now as we're working on season 2 of Ted Lasso, is we're saying, okay, well, we did this, but how can we do it better this time? Even in areas that we don't think there's room for improvement, which again, there's always room for improvement. It's like, well, how can we do this now this time? How can we make the digi doubles look more realistic? How can we make it so that they have hair that moves and so that their clothing looks better? And so that we can do these things with characters that we would have normally shot photographically, but again, we're still in pandemic. We still have some issues shooting them. You know, and how can we do it in a cost-effective way? Because of course we know Hollywood can make fully realistic actors at this point, but you got to make 25,000 of them, right? Like, so you got to figure out how to do that. It's always learning something. And I think the moment you think that you're not learning something, you should probably get out of it, because it means you're burned out.
Yeah. So to finish off, Lawson, I was wondering, like, you talked about how you like that people like the show and that it sort of resonates with people. What do you think the secret to Ted Lasso's success has been? Why has it struck a chord with so many people?
I think I would say that Ted Lasso is just, the show and the character is so earnest. It's comedy, but comedy doesn't have to be cynical, or at least doesn't have to be like completely cynical. You're trying it on some level to be relatable. And I think particularly because of when it hit, and the feelings that people had and the fears that they had in the world, that having something that was sort of inspirational and uplifting and earnest was the right way to do it. And so, like that idea is not dead, essentially. There's always room for it. To me, that's what was so successful about it.
Well, Lawson, thank you so much for talking with us today. All the best of luck with season 2 of Ted Lasso, but also with the upcoming Emmy Awards this year. Congratulations on season 1. If people watching this interview can go to goldderby.com, where you can make your own awards predictions and watch other interviews with award contenders. Lawson, thanks so much for chatting with us.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
No worries.